She made it home. Her medicine stayed behind. Her phone stayed behind. And within hours, the story being told about her disappearance already felt wrong. After a quiet evening with family, walks inside, and is never publicly confirmed on camera again after that moment. At first, it sounds like the kind of case people think they understand in a sentence or two. An elderly woman, a late-night return home, a sudden disappearance. But almost immediately, this story begins to resist the simple version. Because the deeper people looked, the less it behaved like a straightforward missing person case, and the more it felt like a case where the public may have been seeing only the outer shell of something much more controlled. If you follow true crime stories for the details that change everything, this is one of those cases. So stay with me, because one clue in particular shifts the entire way this story can be understood. The last confirmed sequence is simple enough to say out loud. She arrives home, the garage closes, the night goes quiet, and then, hours later, that quiet stops feeling normal. A security device at the front of the house stops working, not because of a routine outage, not because of some random glitch, but because it appears to have been physically removed from the property. That one fact matters because it suggests intention. It suggests someone moved close to the house, knew what they were approaching, and understood that visibility mattered. That is not the kind of detail people usually associate with confusion or panic. It feels deliberate, but that was only the first layer. Because after that, more signals begin to separate from the normal pattern of the night. Another device logs movement. Personal items that would matter to an older person living alone remain inside the home. Her medicine remains there. A device she relied on remains there. And those details quietly push against any idea that she simply chose to go somewhere on her own. The case begins to lean in another direction. Yet even that is only part of why this story keeps drawing attention. Because what happens next is where the case starts to feel structurally wrong. Very quickly, messages begin to appear, demands begin to surface. A story starts forming around the disappearance, and on the surface, it points toward a money-driven crime. But the structure of that story has always raised difficult questions. In a case where money is the goal, the people making the demands usually need one thing above all else. They need leverage that can be verified. They need the family to believe the situation is active, real, and under someone else's control. And in this case, that reassurance never appears in the way people would expect. Deadlines come, deadlines pass, but the one element that would make the situation feel concrete never fully settles the doubt. And that detail has never stopped bothering investigators, analysts, or the public. Because when the central claim of a case depends on pressure, but the pressure mechanism itself feels weak, people naturally begin asking a harder question. Was the story being told built around what actually happened, or built to shape how people would interpret what happened? Before we go further, ask yourself this: if someone wanted money, why would they allow uncertainty to swallow the very thing they needed most? And this is where the case becomes even more difficult to dismiss as random, because some of the messages reportedly included details that had not been publicly released, not broad guesses, not vague language, specific references linked to the inside of the home. That changes everything, because once private details enter the picture, the case is no longer just about an unknown person approaching a property in the dark. It becomes a case about access, familiarity, or information passed from someone who knew more than the public did. And that one shift opens an entirely different lane of suspicion. If you want more documentary breakdowns that focus on the logic behind the case instead of just the headlines, like this video now. Because the next part is where the case stops looking like one bad night and starts looking like a process. At a later stage of the investigation, recovered data reportedly pointed to something deeply unsettling. The possibility that someone had been at that same home weeks before the disappearance. No dramatic confrontation, no obvious attempt to act, just presence, quiet presence. And that detail matters because it changes the timeline from a single event into a sequence. It raises the possibility that the final night was not the beginning of the story. It may have been the end of a setup period the public only learned about later. That is one of the strongest attention points in the entire case, because a prior visit suggests observation. It suggests patience. It suggests someone may have been testing routines, confirming habits, or studying the property before returning with more purpose. And once you consider that, the entire emotional center of the story changes. It is no longer just frightening because someone may have come to the house that night. It becomes more unsettling because someone may have been learning the house long before that night. And this is where another big question enters. If there was an earlier visit, what exactly was being confirmed? The schedule? The layout? The quietest point in the night? Or something even more specific? That question becomes harder to ignore when you place it next to the reports of private details from inside the home appearing later in the case. Because now two separate ideas begin leaning toward the same conclusion. This may not have been based on chance. It may have depended on knowledge. And knowledge has to come from somewhere. This is also why so much attention has gone toward whether one visible person was ever the whole story. Because several details point away from a one-person event. Reports about communication devices. Reports suggesting more than one outside profile may have been identified in the home. Reports that imply coordination rather than improvisation. None of that proves the full picture publicly. But together, those details create a strong impression that the person people focused on first may not have been the only person who mattered. In fact, the person seen may have been the most visible part of something larger, while the most important role may have belonged to someone who was never clearly shown at all. And that is where this case becomes psychologically sharper. Because viewers naturally look for the face, the figure, the image that can hold the whole story. But some cases resist that. Some cases are not solved by asking who was seen. They move closer to being understood by asking who had knowledge, who had timing, who had access, and who could have turned ordinary routine into vulnerability. Comment below with your honest take at this point. Do you think this looks more like outside surveillance or prior knowledge coming from someone much closer to the environment? That question matters because investigators reportedly turned their attention in a very specific direction. Not only toward random strangers or unfamiliar vehicles, but toward people who may have had legitimate reasons to be inside homes in the area. Service workers, contractors, people who could have been present without causing alarm. And that line of interest tells you something important about how the case may have been evolving behind the scenes. It suggests that some of the most serious questions were no longer about forced entry in the usual sense. They were about familiarity, about trust, about whether the most useful information in this case may have been gathered in plain sight under ordinary circumstances before anyone realized it would matter. That possibility is disturbing for a different reason than the typical true crime headline, because it turns the home from a place of safety into a place where routine itself may have created exposure. It is one thing to fear an unknown intruder. It is another thing entirely to wonder whether someone had learned enough about a person's habits through normal access, ordinary visits, or everyday visibility. That idea lingers because it feels possible in a way many viewers understand immediately. And as the case kept moving, another layer made everything even harder to process. The public handling of the story began to feel uneven. Some details appeared to shift. Some statements were later questioned. Some parts of the public narrative did not seem to match the direction investigators were reportedly taking on the ground. And while early confusion can happen in any major investigation, the effect here was cumulative. It left people with the sense that the case was being described one way while being worked another way. That gap matters because once public trust starts slipping, then every update starts carrying two meanings: what is being said and what may be left unsaid. And this is where the case takes one of its darkest turns, not because of graphic detail, but because of logic. Several experienced voices began publicly questioning whether the case truly fit the structure it first appeared to fit, not necessarily rejecting the public version outright, but questioning whether the available pieces actually behaved the way that type of crime usually behaves. That is an important distinction, because sometimes the most telling thing in an investigation is not one dramatic clue. It is the failure of the overall pattern to hold together. And in this case, that structural weakness keeps returning. The timing feels unusual. The messaging feels unstable. The private details feel too informed. The earlier visit feels too meaningful to dismiss. The possibility of coordination feels too significant to ignore. And once all of that is placed together, the case begins to feel less like one mystery and more like two. What happened to Nancy, and how the story of what happened to Nancy was shaped in public. And that is what keeps people locked into this case. Because the farther you go, the less the central tension seems to be about a single missing hour or a single piece of evidence. It becomes about whether the first explanation people reached for was ever strong enough to carry the weight of the facts. If you care about cases where the smallest contradiction opens the biggest question, subscribe now. Because stories like this are never really about one clue, and they are about the moment the entire pattern starts bending in the wrong direction. There is also a human side to this that should never be lost. Behind every theory, every timeline, every statement, and every contradiction is an older woman who returned home expecting an ordinary night. A person with routine, with needs, with family, with habits that should have made life more predictable, not more dangerous. That is part of why this case has stayed with so many people. The story is not driven by spectacle. It is driven by the quiet force of interruption, a normal evening, a familiar return home, then absence, then uncertainty, then a chain of details that refuse to settle into one clean answer. That is powerful because it feels close to real life. It does not need graphic detail to stay with you. The simplicity of what changed is enough. One ordinary night becomes the dividing line between before and after. And everything after that night has carried the feeling that the truth may have been partially visible from the beginning, but hidden behind a version of events that was easier for the public to process in real time. That may be why the case continues to hold attention. Not just because it is unresolved, but because it feels like there are two levels to it. The visible level, where a disappearance was quickly linked to a clear public narrative, and the deeper level, where the evidence keeps hinting that the real center of gravity may be somewhere else. Somewhere in the earlier visit, somewhere in the private details, somewhere in the possible coordination, somewhere in the gap between what was said and what was later questioned. And that brings us to the most unsettling takeaway of all. Sometimes the biggest mystery in a case is not the event itself. It is the possibility that the public was encouraged to focus on the most visible version of the story, while the most important questions lived somewhere just outside the frame. If this case has stayed on your mind, share this video with someone who pays attention to detail, because another set of eyes sometimes catches the one pattern everyone else missed. And if you think the public version of this case left too many gaps too early, say that in the comments, because those reactions reveal how people are really reading the evidence. As of now, the public still does not have every answer. The distance between what is known and what can be fully explained remains significant. But what can be said is this: a woman returned home, disappeared from the ordinary rhythm of her life, and left behind a case where the timeline, the messages, the private details, and the questions around access have all made the story heavier, not clearer. That is why this case continues to matter. Not because it offers easy certainty, but because it forces a more difficult kind of attention. The kind that notices when the pattern does not hold. The kind that keeps asking whether the first story was the full story. The kind that refuses to look away when the surface explanation stops making sense. So now I want your view. Do you think this case was misunderstood from the start? Or do you think key parts of it have simply not been fully explained yet? Put your theory in the comments. Like the video if you want more serious true crime breakdowns in this style. Subscribe if you want the next case before everyone else finds it. And share this with one person who never settles for the first version of a story. Because in a case like this, that instinct matters.